Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I'm Tom Lenny. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. And a few years ago, I think it goes back already, we were asking some questions. We were thinking about the classics and some of the areas that we work with. And I asked Tim and I asked a couple of people if there were ways that we could do some programming together between the McFarland Center and classics. And really, I sort of began by asking questions about, well, there are all these stories in the classics or whatever, but how do we think about classics as a way of communicating about ethics? And sometimes there are these crazy stories or misogynistic stories or whatever. So what do we do with all this information? We've gone around and around some different ways about thinking about the ethical implications of the classics. And as we were doing that, Tim came and suggested, actually said, well, there's actually this good book that thinks about this in some different fashion by Eric Adler. And Tim suggested to us that we work in that direction. So I'm always reliant on smarter people than me to help think through some of these issues. So that's how we got to here today. The McFarland Center sponsors lectures, discussions, and conferences and performances, other programs that explore issues of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. You can find more about upcoming events at the center and watch past events at holycross.edu/McFarland Center. And today's event will be one of those. So if you're non-classics majors friends, if you want to tell them they really missed something great that will change their minds and make them become a classics major in a day or two, they can watch that in their dorm rooms. So I'm pleased to introduce Eric Adler and want to, as I said, thank Tim Joseph for making this possible and the Classics Department for co-sponsoring with us. Eric's going to help us think about the role of the classics through the history of American higher education and what's lost when a culture no longer believes in the perfection of the human being as an education's goal. Eric is Associate Professor of Classics at the University of Maryland. Previously, he taught at Rice University, the University of Minnesota, and Connecticut College. His scholarly interests include Greco-Roman historiography, Latin prose, Roman imperialism, the classical tradition, and the history of classical scholarship. He's the author of Valorizing the Barbarians, Enemy Speeches in Roman Historiography, published in 2011, and has published a number of journal articles and book chapters. Today's talk draws on his newest book, Classics, The Culture Wars and Beyond, published by the University of Michigan Press. So please join me in welcoming Eric Adler.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I've never worn this kind of a microphone before, so it's going to take me a second to get used to. I feel like I might work at Burger King or something like that. But I gather everyone can hear me. I also have an annoyingly loud voice that wouldn't require this normally, so I apologize for that too. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a real pleasure and an honor for me to be at Holy Cross for the first time in my life, though I'm from the Boston area. And to be at Holy Cross more generally, I have to say also it's quite a surprise here in late October that I came from Washington, D.C., and the weather is better here than it was in D.C., which tells you something, I guess. And I have to say also more generally, as someone who has taught classics for a while now, I must say that I am in awe of Holy Cross College and have been for some time. Especially as a native of the Boston area, as I've already said, I have constantly heard stories about how impressive the classics department is at the College of the Holy Cross. Which speaks, I think, to the department's grand successes. At conferences and in hallways of various campuses across the nation, let me just tell you that various classicists have asked me questions like, did you know that Holy Cross has 10 classics professors? This is said with regularity. How in Lord's name do they do this? And this is especially impressive as a feat for a department that offers a BA degree. By comparison, in my own now home state of Maryland, I think the largest classics department in the state is my own University of Maryland at College Park, which offers a BA and an MA and has 6 classics professors. And Johns Hopkins is the only one in the state to offer a PhD, and it has 5 classics professors. So clearly you're doing something right, or we're doing something wrong, or perhaps both, I guess it's safe to say. And you could argue, I suppose, that what I'm going to talk about today seems less vital at Holy Cross, since the institution, at least to an outsider such as myself, appears to have a comparatively strong commitment to the study of classical antiquity. And still, I hope my remarks today, which pertain to the to the proper goal of classical studies in American higher education, and more broadly, what it means to be an educated person, are important for all of us to discuss and to consider. For certainly, despite Holy Cross's robust, I said that strangely twice, robust commitment to the discipline, classical studies, I think, are limping along on campuses across the nation. That may not be true here, it seems not to be true here, but nevertheless, I think it's true in America overall. And I want to offer some history to explain these vicissitudes and to argue that an earlier approach to the humanities can help us remedy our current predicament. If anything, my talk this afternoon is going to stress that the dominant approach to the meaning and value of higher education in America is impoverished. It will also argue that connecting with an earlier spirit of humanism can offer a more robust approach to education's value, and it can revivify the humanities. My talk stems from some of my research for my second book, which is titled Classics, the Culture Wars and Beyond, and the only plug I will offer today is available on November 28th from the University of Michigan Press and fine bookstores wherever they are now these days. The book itself is a foray into the history of classical scholarship. More specifically, the book attempts to examine the fate of American classical studies in an especially fraught period in the history of U.S. higher education. According to many academics and intellectuals, the 1980s and 1990s in the United States witnessed an especially prominent public battle over cultural attitudes. Writers of various outlooks typically refer to this period as the heyday of the American culture wars. The culture wars in the United States in the 1980s and 1990s surrounded such contentious topics as abortion and gay rights, affirmative action, multiculturalism, and even public funding for the arts. Somewhat surprisingly, a major facet of this culture wars of the 1980s and 1990s was an especially noisy and attention-grabbing debate on the subject of higher education in the United States. This academic culture war, if you will, chiefly surrounded the nature and of teaching and research in the humanities in American colleges and universities. It thus serves as a particularly important period for those investigating the history and the likely fate of classical studies, more specifically, and liberal arts more generally in U.S. higher education. Thus, much of my forthcoming book focuses on various scandals in American classical studies that took place in the context of the academic culture wars of the 1980s and 1990s. But the book also attempts to provide a brief intellectual history of the academic culture wars themselves. One major theme in this portion of the book is that classical studies played a surprisingly small part in the American academic culture wars. As I attempt to demonstrate in the book, the fights over the humanities in American colleges and universities in the late 20th century focused the large majority of their attention on the study of English literature, along with some of the new disciplines associated with the politics of the New Left, such as women's studies and black studies, Latino and Latina studies, and so forth. And all this led me to wonder, why did classical studies play such a small part in a long-standing and attention-grabbing debate on the nature of the humanities in American higher education? If Americans were so concerned about the humanities in the 1980s and 1990s, why did the debates surrounding them almost never focus on the classics, which is the wellspring of the humanities? In order to answer these questions, my book offers a brief history of the role of classics in American higher education. And I want to share some of that history with you this afternoon or this evening, whatever you want to call 4:30, and for a number of reasons. First, I think that this history can give you a good sense of the ways in which American higher education has fundamentally altered over time. Further, I think that this history forces us to think about the proper focus and role of higher education in America and what it means to be an educated person. In addition, I think that this history sheds light on some major troubles, both for classical studies and for the humanities in general in the decades to come. These troubles may be less apparent at the College of the Holy Cross than elsewhere, but I would imagine that no institution of higher education in this country is immune to them. And I'm going to argue that we should reassert connections to an earlier tradition of humanism, which links education to salutary character formation. So in order for me to offer some comments on the intellectual history and plight of American higher education, we're going to have to start with the Renaissance. To start very basically indeed, we can say that the Renaissance occurred in Western Europe between the 14th and 16th centuries AD. The term Renaissance itself means rebirth in French. I learned that in grade school. And it refers to the rebirth of knowledge from Greco-Roman antiquity. The term also signifies the period that witnessed the rebirth of Western civilization as the result of the rediscovery of knowledge from ancient Greek and Roman civilizations. During the course of the Renaissance, beginning in Italy in the 14th century AD, numerous learned men became extremely devoted to the study of Greco-Roman antiquity. This is very much related to the history of the so-called humanities. Naturally, the word humanities is still used in higher education circles today. In contemporary parlance, the term humanities is rather nebulous. It refers to a group of academic disciplines, essentially those disciplines that are not in the hard sciences, that are not in the social sciences, and that are not in the fine arts, and are not particularly vocational either. It thus encompasses a number of contemporary academic fields: English, classics, German, French, philosophy, and so forth. So in contemporary parlance, the term humanities broadly refers to a number of academic disciplines, many of which revolve around the study of language. Yet this is very different from the original conception of a humanist, a term first employed by learned men and learned women during the Renaissance. The term humanities ultimately has an ancient Roman pedigree. In fact, as far as we can determine, it seems to stem from the Roman orator and statesman and writer Cicero. In a defense speech from 62 BC called the Proarchia, Cicero refers to the studia humanitatis, that is to say, the studies of culture. In a number of his works, Cicero makes clear that the studia humanitatis are the same as the artes liberales. And in fact, the term liberal arts is first used by Cicero in the extant literature. We're not sure whether he coined it or whether someone else coined it, but in our extant literature, he's the first person to mention the term. That is to say, Cicero's discussion of the studia humanitatis pertained to his vision of the proper education for a member of the Roman elite. And thus the term liberal arts ultimately has a Roman pedigree. It originally refers to those subjects Cicero thought proper for the education of a free-born person, a person for whom training in the liberal arts, as opposed to the servile arts or technical skills, was appropriate. Numerous learned men in the course of the Renaissance used Cicero's thoughts on the studia humanitatis as a springboard for their own conception of the proper education of elites. In fact, these learned men deemed themselves humanists, as a tip of the cap to Cicero. And they promoted a particular vision of education that was originally rooted in Latin learning and ultimately rooted in Greek and Latin learning. The Renaissance promoted a type of education that would become institutionalized in Western colleges for hundreds of years. The earliest descriptions of the Renaissance humanist vision of education came from Coluccio Salutati, who lived from 1331 until 1406, and Leonardo Bruni, who lived from 1370 until 1444. Harkening back to Cicero, Salutati and Bruni used the term studia humanitatis to describe the new pedagogy that they support. Although they borrowed this term from Cicero, Salutati, Bruni, and later Renaissance humanists had their own distinct meaning for it. The Renaissance humanists advocated a new kind of pedagogy, one that was rooted in the study of authors from Greek and Roman antiquity, and one that supposedly offered very different benefits from those encouraged by Western universities in the medieval period. To the Renaissance humanists, the goal of education was the shaping of character. And humanists such as Salutati and Bruni believed that the study of ancient Latin literature, and to a lesser extent the study of ancient Greek literature, was the key to shaping one's character. For their new curriculum, the Renaissance humanists touted the imitation of ancient Latin and the study of Latin and Greek literature, history, and moral philosophy as guides for how one ought to live one's life. In pushing these subjects, the Renaissance humanists were in favor of the study of classical, that is to say, ancient Latin, as opposed to medieval Latin, which they found dry and vulgar and unstylish. The humanists believed that the study of ancient Greek and Latin literature and moral philosophy and history could make a person good. Key to this conception was the studying of particular authors. The Renaissance humanists advocated the study of classical Latin. One was both to learn from these authors and to learn to write like these authors. And according to the Renaissance humanists, certain subjects and certain authors were worthy of study, whereas others were not. According to Bruni, for example, one should focus one's education on studies that pertain either to religion or the good life. Those are the two things you should focus on, studying literature in order to understand religion or the good life. In regard to religion, Bruni argued that one should focus on the early church fathers, especially Augustine, but no one after Augustine. In regard to secular studies, Bruni believed that one should examine the appropriate writings from the ancient Greeks and the Romans. More specifically, one should study their works that pertain to the good life and figure out from them what the good life was. Thus, key to the humanities in the original Renaissance conception of the term was a focus on moral philosophy, using literature for moral philosophy. To the Renaissance humanists, the classical writers had both literary and moral value. The Renaissance humanists believed that classical authors such as Homer and Sallust and Caesar and Cicero and Virgil could offer students wisdom and eloquence. These studies, studying them in the original language, supposedly perfected the human being. Thus, to the Renaissance humanists, the humanities referred to what we would now call a classical education, or at least a classical education of a certain sort. The focus was on Greek and Latin literature and moral philosophy at the expense of other topics. This is important because the Renaissance humanists became greatly influential in pushing their model of a proper education. Since it had spread throughout much of Europe by the late 16th century, Renaissance humanism was able to have the chief intellectual influence on the American colonial colleges. Accordingly, the study of ancient Greek and Roman writers became the bedrock of secondary and college education in America for centuries. It was only in the latter half of the 19th century, as we're going to talk about, that colleges and universities in the United States began to move away from a strict reliance on the Renaissance conception of the humanities as the basis for higher education in this country. Until the late 19th century, higher education in America focused chiefly on what we would call a classical education. For this reason, when Harvard College was founded as New College in 1636, it advertised the following as its standard for admissions for new students. So in 1636, if you want to get into Harvard, here's what you've got to do. Quote, "When any scholar is able to read Tully," and by that they mean Cicero, "or such like classical author extempore, and to make and speak true Latin verse and prose, and decline perfectly the paradigms of nouns and verbs in the Greek tongue, then may he be admitted into the college, nor shall any claim admission before such qualifications." End quote. And similarly, it was only in the late 1870s that American colleges and universities first established majors. Before this time, every college student in the United States studied roughly the same exact prescribed curriculum, a curriculum that was dominated by the study of Latin and ancient Greek. Now, to us, this deep concern for ancient Greek and Latin literature may seem strange. To some of us it may not, but to others it may. But it made sense in the context of the Renaissance and its aftermath. After all, a renewed engagement with classical Greek and Latin learning was chiefly responsible for the flourishing of Europe that began in the Renaissance. And as a result, it's not surprising that the Renaissance humanists and their followers believed that the wisdom imparted by authors from classical antiquity was the means through which to perfect the human being, and also the means through which to consider oneself an educated person. As a result of this hyper-focus on classical learning, subjects that are a regular part of contemporary colleges and universities in this country actually turn out to be surprising latecomers to American higher education. Harvard, for instance, only founded its first professorship in modern languages in 1816. And originally, you couldn't study the modern languages as part of the formal curriculum. You had to do that on your own time. In 1857, Lafayette College appointed what appears to be the first professor of English in the country. And he was a professor of English and comparative philology, which makes it sound a little bit better, I guess. This appointment would influence other American institutions to make English a formal part of their curricula in the years following the Civil War. Yale introduced the nation's first university program in the fine arts in 1869. And the social sciences would have to wait until the late 19th century for their full inclusion in the American college curriculum. Since most, if not all, courses in early American colleges were prescribed, that is, they required of all students, the addition of new disciplines to the curriculum naturally threatened the curricular dominance of the classical languages. And surely the natural sciences amounted to the chief threat to the centering of the college curriculum around the classical languages. The Renaissance humanists had shunned the natural sciences because their studies supposedly did not contribute to the perfection of the human being. I'm marginally supportive of that view, but nevertheless, that's for another day. As the Enlightenment wore on, however, the exclusion of the natural sciences became increasingly difficult to defend. The study of the natural sciences, moreover, implicitly attacked the intellectual rationale associated with Renaissance humanism. For the Renaissance humanists, the goal of education was the shaping of character. The natural sciences, on the other hand, first and foremost aimed to produce new knowledge. Especially in the course of the 19th century, many proponents of non-classical subjects aimed to add these subjects to the American college curriculum. And since the American colleges had at this time chiefly prescribed curricula that did not allow much in the way of student choice, the inclusion of these new subjects was naturally a threat to the dominance of the classical languages in U.S. higher education. Although there were hints of the changes to come in American higher education during America's early history, these changes became much more dramatic in the aftermath of the American Civil War, which lasted from 1861 until 1865. The 19th century witnessed the so-called professionalization of Western higher education, a process that was first undertaken in Germany. In the course of the 19th century, first in Germany, prospective professors went through rigorous graduate studies in their prospective field, which led them to earn the PhD degree. Prior to the professionalization, teaching at American colleges seems largely to have been a temporary job rather than a career, something we may actually be moving back to, but that, again, is for another afternoon. In early America, instruction was chiefly in the hands of the college president and a number of academic tutors who were themselves recent college graduates. Prior to the German influence on American education in the late 19th century, even professors in American colleges often had little advanced training in their presumed subjects of expertise. Most often, their moral strengths recommended them for their jobs, and many would continue on to careers in the ministry. Such a background fit educational institutions that were chiefly concerned with the molding of character through the inculcation of the received wisdom of the ancients. In the course of the late 19th century in America, many of these elements of early American higher education began to change, as U.S. colleges began to take their cues from changes that had first occurred in Germany. Professionalization, specialization, and research would ultimately become essential features of American academic life. For example, in the late 19th century in the U.S., the faculty of U.S. colleges split up for the first time into distinct academic departments based on the subjects of their expertise. So now you have, in the late 19th century, a French department and a classics department and a biology department and so forth. The late 19th century in America also witnessed a further broadening of potential subjects of study at American institutions of higher education. Going along with this would be the removal of ancient Greek and Latin from the center of American colleges and universities. Thus, the late 19th century America witnessed the end of the old prescribed classical curriculum. The most prominent figure associated with the demise of the old prescribed classical curriculum in American higher education is a fellow named Charles W. Eliot, who lived from 1834 until 1926, Charles W. Eliot. Eliot, who was president of Harvard from 1869 until 1909, became the most tireless advocate of the so-called free elective system. Eliot advocated in favor of the replacement of the old prescribed classical curriculum with an elective-based curriculum. In Eliot's system, students could choose any course that they wanted to take. Implicit in Eliot's support for a system of elected courses was the notion of a university as a free market, a space in which competition would occur between the disciplines to the supposed benefit of the students and also to the disciplines themselves. Although Eliot was not shy, if students didn't come, the disciplines wouldn't exist at the university any longer. Also implicit in a free market system is a major change in the intellectual mission of American colleges and universities. The Renaissance humanists had argued that the study of Greek and Latin authors was key to the perfection of the human being. Now these ideals in the late 19th century are being cast aside. The free elective system implicitly signaled that there were many different kinds of knowledge, and none was necessarily more important than any other. Gone was the old idea of a unity of knowledge, that the study of a certain subject or of certain authors could make one an educated person. Instead, the free elective system contended that a college education was chiefly about introducing students to certain discipline-based skills. According to Eliot's system, one does not need to understand any specific content in order to deem oneself an educated person. Now, to be sure, there have been a number of reforms to Eliot's free elective system since it was first introduced in the late 19th century, originally at Cornell and then ultimately popularized at Harvard. The Johns Hopkins University, for instance, inaugurated the academic major and minor in 1877, it seems. The major and minor system required, as it does today, students to take a certain number of courses in their specific discipline, which would be the focus of their studies. Similarly, American educators have experimented with different kinds of general education since the demise of the old classical curriculum and the years following the American Civil War. These days, students typically have to take a number of courses in a variety of different types of disciplines as part of their undergraduate education. Thus, for example, as part of general education, many students are compelled to take a class or two in the humanities, a foreign language, or maybe not, that's starting to fall away, a class in the arts, a hard science class, and so forth. Okay? This is called the distribution model of general education. It appears, and I don't want to pontificate about this because I'm in a room of people who know, everyone knows more about this than I do, but it appears as if Holy Cross has a version of this at its own institution. And this was established by A. Lawrence Lowell at Harvard, who was the president of Harvard directly after Eliot left. The distribution model. But importantly, these new sorts of curricula, which owe their origins to changes that took place in higher education in the 19th century, removed the study of the Greek and Roman classics from their central position in American higher education. These days, even students at the most prestigious American colleges and universities are not required to study Latin and ancient Greek. The only one I know of, there must be some others, but St. John's College, there's a branch of it in Annapolis and there's one in Santa Fe. That requires 2 years of ancient Greek along with French for some reason. That's the only one I know that requires one of these languages. And most American students, even at very prestigious American colleges and universities, do not take classics courses at all. In order to compete in this new intellectual and pedagogical environment, many American educators in the 1850s and 1860s began to reconceptualize the humanities. Thanks to the Renaissance humanists, the humanities, that is to say the studia humanitatis, for centuries referred to the study of authors from Greek and Roman antiquity. As the 19th century wore on, however, opponents of academic vocationalism began to shift their arguments in favor of liberal studies more generally. Recognizing the sorry future for compulsory collegiate Greek and Latin, these thinkers widened the popular conception of the humanities to encompass a sort of elevating study of literature, music, and the arts. This marked a seismic shift in the arguments advanced by proponents of liberal education. They now, as of the 1850s and 1860s, imbued a variety of academic disciplines like English and French and philosophy and art history, with a power that had previously been accorded to the classics alone. All this signaled profound challenges for classical studies in the United States. From the heart of American higher education, the classics have now become a kind of boutique discipline. According to the U.S. Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics, in the 2011-2012 academic year, there were close to 4,000 two-year and four-year colleges and universities in the United States. But only around 400 such institutions have classics departments. Hence, Americans who choose to major in classics routinely have to explain what the classics are to interlocutors. As a classics major myself, and also now the fun continues as a classics professor now, I've had people ask me whether I study Charles Dickens or whether I play the piano. To those who did not attend a certain type of high school or college or university, classical studies don't mean anything. In the broader picture, as I argue in my book, The free elective system, popularized by Charles Eliot at Harvard, has caused all sorts of problems for higher education and all sorts of problems for the liberal arts. This is not to suggest, I am not attempting to suggest, that Renaissance humanists offered a completely unproblematic curriculum to which we should simply return and say that everything is now right in the world. Renaissance humanism has many weaknesses associated with it, and it seems unfit for the contemporary world. But at the very least, the Renaissance humanists had a vision of what it means to be an educated person, and they chose content that they thought would be most conducive to the creation of such an educated person. The free elective system and the distribution model, by contrast, implicitly signal to students that content does not matter. As long as one learns a handful of discipline-based skills, one can deem oneself an educated person. It is not a surprise that many students find this vision of education hollow, and they react by choosing a course of studies that seems either the easiest and/or the most pragmatic. The free elective system and the distribution model treat students as consumers, and this, I try to argue in my book, has caused all manner of problems in American higher education. Without a vision of what it means to be an educated person, students, especially in trying economic times, typically turn to vocationalism. This is one major reason, that the humanities today are not faring very well on many American colleges and university campuses. And it should also be clear why the history I've offered signals serious challenges for classical studies in the United States. And this is why the academic culture wars focused chiefly on the study of English literature. Well before the 1980s, in the 1850s and the 1860s, in fact, the classics had passed the torch of the humanities to English departments, which had by now become the dominant element in the new humanities. Thus, combatants in the academic culture wars of the 1980s and 1990s were often unaware that our conception of the humanities is very much a late 19th century one, distinct from and largely opposed to centuries of Western educational history. Again, I am not trying to argue that a return to the spirit of Renaissance humanism is going to cure everything for American higher education. But I do believe that the dominant approach to general education in U.S. colleges and universities presents us with an impoverished view of what it means to be an educated person, one that implicitly contends that discipline-based skills are the sole attainments of the educated man and the educated woman. To thrive in the present and in the future, humanists need to fight against this system in favor of a more concrete vision of what it means to be an educated person. Thank you very much. I think very much is the answer to that. So the question was, how much does the cost of higher education have an influence on people seeing it as vocational training? I think that has a lot to do with it. It's not the only thing, though. Also, we have to recognize, when we're talking about 1636 in Harvard, we're talking about an extremely small percentage of Americans who are going to be attending college, and that this was seen as a way to be part of one of the three so-called learned professions. You were going to go into ministry, you were going to go into law, or you were going to go into medicine. And these were areas for which you needed some grounding in the classical languages, right? Nowadays, we have a vastly expanded, since the GI Bill of 1944, and even a little bit before then, but certainly 1944 is a major change, a vast increase in the number of people who go to college, and they go for different reasons, too. So there's a whole different traditions of different sorts of schools. The school I'm at, University of Maryland, was originally an agricultural college, right? So there's very different sorts of things. So there's been a great democratization, if you will, of higher education. I think that's part of it. And then the costs, right? It's not unreasonable that people are trying to be vocational about this because there's a lot of cost that's associated with it. I find that at the University of Maryland, when we have classics majors, most often, not always, but most often they have one major for themselves, which is classics, and then one major for their parents, right? Which oftentimes is engineering or economics or business or what have you, right? And so there's a nervousness on the part of parents that they're going to invest a fair amount of money in this, and it's going to come to naught. Now, I think if you start to look more carefully at what the actual results are, you will find that actually majoring in something that seems deeply vocational is not a panacea for this kind of a problem. But nevertheless, that sort of idea persists. I think, however, it is more likely to persist in an academic and intellectual environment in which we do not offer students and parents a vision of what it means to be educated. So without that vision, people naturally turn to vocationalism anyway, and I think they would even if college and university wasn't so expensive. There's an interesting essay, I forget the title, by John Stuart Mill, who was fearing that people's jobs were going to become so mechanized that they needed a liberal education now more than ever, because if not, they're going to kill themselves, because they're going to work in these factories and the job is so boring that if they don't have anything higher to look at, no kind of aspiration, that they're just not going to continue to live. It's going to be so grim. And as a result, it's important to try to spread the liberal arts to others so that people will have some higher ideal, so that civilization can continue, right? So then there's sort of a movement in other directions too, and there have been attempts to try to make the liberal arts more appealing to broader populations as well. The second question, I guess, is about, or comment is about sort of an American version of classical studies. I mean, I think it is certainly true that there is probably a stronger tradition of anti-intellectualism in this country than in many European countries from which many original Americans came. And that has always sat poorly with this real deep concern for the classics. It is always surprising. I teach a class called Are We Rome at the University of Maryland, and it focuses a great deal on the kind of Roman pedigree of the United States, which includes the U.S. Constitution and the plebeian influences on it and checks and balances and so forth. And oftentimes students are just amazed and semi-appalled that early American education was like this. From the very early times, there was a kind of movement away from this. People were very concerned about how European this education actually seemed. So I think that is definitely part of our own traditions. I would say, however, that American classical scholars have not been terribly successful at crafting an American-specific vision of classical studies. That our conception of classical studies is still almost entirely German. And as a result, we have the Society for Classical Studies, and the person who ends up being the president of the Society for Classical Studies every year invariably is someone who comes from a fancy PhD program, who's someone who is a great researcher, and that doing minute research is seen as the sort of apex of being a classical scholar, and that if you're a great teacher or a great program coordinator and so forth, that these things are less important than doing narrow research. Similarly, I think if you look at the way that American PhD programs work, this second book I worked on could not have been my first book. It couldn't have been my dissertation because I would never have gotten through a classics PhD program with that. There's still very kind of narrow philological requirements for people to get through particular programs. I think that is all still very German in conception. And there have been fits and starts of Americans who try to make the classics their own. I'm not so sure that classical scholars have been, on the whole, very successful at doing that. Which is another reason I think I remember when I told my parents that I'd like to study Latin for kind of no reason. I think it was because there was a great high school teacher I took Latin with. And I told my parents that I wanted to study Latin in high school, and they went, "Ooh, Mr. Fancy," or whatever, They wouldn't have done that if I wanted to study any other foreign language. There is this kind of sense that it's a class-based thing, and it is also called classics. But at the same period of time, I think a lot of other subjects, even from the early American college curriculum, don't have that baggage associated with it. That was a very long answer to those 2 points. Any other questions? To some degree, I think, though, it is largely top-down, in part because American public high schools got started later than Harvard did and other institutions. And so it was really these colonial institutions that ended up setting what the curriculum was going to be for high schools or for tutors who were going to tutor people so that they could go on to college. And so once you get rid of collegiate Latin and Greek as a requirement, you now can get rid of it in the high school because people who need that in order to get into college don't need that any longer. So I do think it's sort of largely been that way. If you look at the numbers, there was a dramatic decrease in the percentages of Americans taking Latin in high school as you get into late 1960s and into the 1970s. It's kind of flatlined from there, but there was a tremendous drop, about 70% kind of drop from what it had been beforehand. So clearly the requirement to take Latin died, and that has ended up having a major impact, which is another reason why I think having a very strong connection to high school instruction is deeply important for classical professors across the country. I would gather that one of the reasons why Holy Cross has 10 classics professors is because a number of people here come from Catholic institutions where in high school they're more likely to take Latin. So they come in with Latin and so forth, and so they're already ready to go, and which is one of the reasons why it's robust. It's certainly not the only reason, but I think that's one of the reasons. We ignore what's going on in the high schools at our peril. Without a robust kind of market for Latin, there's basically no market for Greek. I mean, you have to go to Phillips Andover or something like that for Greek. But the robust market for Latin, things are going to get worse and worse at the college level, I think. It's depressing as someone who never went to Harvard that they actually are capable of doing that, but they seem to have been capable of doing that. What can one do? Although Eliot was following largely Andrew White, who was the president of Cornell, who was the first person. He actually inaugurated the free market kind of a system, and Eliot popularized it. But right. Maybe it didn't make that much of a difference, but that I think had something to do with it as well. And once those requirements fall, then once you don't make this stuff required any longer, people drop away. My issues, and look, I don't want to say, because there's a lot of undergraduates in here, I had the pick and choose curriculum too. And when I went through the pick and choose curriculum, I made some dumb decisions that were based on fear, I think. I had gotten into my head that I was not a science or math person. And one of the reasons I wanted to go to a pick and choose curriculum kind of place is because I wanted to avoid hard math and science classes, basically. That's essentially what I was doing. And everyone in my day, everyone wanted to go to Brown, because Brown you could do whatever in Lord's name you wanted, it seemed, right? And everyone wanted to go there, and I wanted to go there so badly, and I didn't get in, and I wanted to go there so badly. And now I actually wish in retrospect that I had gone to a place that had a more concrete vision of what it means to be an educated person. Because it's a very strange thing to ask someone who's 18, who's not educated, what courses should you take in order to become an educated person? I made some decent choices, and I made some bad ones, but I don't think I can be fully to blame because the institution had no right to ask me that question under the circumstances. I think a lot of this comes from the notion that every person is completely individual and unique, and therefore has his or her own spiritual and intellectual requirements. And although I do think that people are unique, I'm not trying to say we're all automata or something like that, don't get me wrong, especially because this is being recorded. But at the same period of time, I still believe that being connected with some sort of tradition is very important. There's a very powerful part to an otherwise kind of divisive book called The Closing of the American Mind from 1987 by Alan Bloom. And Alan Bloom talks in one portion of this book, which was a major book of the academic culture wars, of students who go through or people who have been students, they've finished education or they're in the middle of their studies and they go through a museum. And all they see are pretty pictures. And the reason all they see are pretty pictures is because they've never studied the Bible and they've never studied the classics. So all of this stuff that is on the walls for them to see means nothing to them because they're completely unlinked to any kind of tradition. Maybe that's overstated. I think you can enjoy museums for different reasons too. But I do feel this centralessness in American higher education, which is not very good for the humanities. Any other questions? In the book itself, so what's the good life is the question. All right, good. All right, hold on a second. I'll tell you in a second. If I could tell you exactly what the good life is, I can assure you that I would have a much higher, fancier job title and I'd be making a heck of a lot more money than I am currently. But in the book itself, I deliberately try not to answer that question with my own prescriptive answer, and there's a reason for this. And that is, I really wanted to encourage, well, first of all, it's because I don't know exactly what the good life is, so that's the sort of obvious, reason. That's number one. I'll tell you when I get there. But the second answer is that I didn't want to get into the same trap that Victor Davis Hanson and John Heath got into in their book called Who Killed Homer. There's a chapter of the book that's on this, in which they offer their vision of what they call Greek wisdom and why you should study the classics to begin with. And people fought so much over their vision of Greek wisdom and what they thought, people thought it was jingoistic and, imperialistic and so forth, that they never really got to the larger questions of that book, which is, what's the point of classical studies? Instead, they just sort of saw their point and said, that's not the point. But they didn't feel duty-bound to offer their own answer to that question. My answer, I think, would be that individual colleges and universities and their faculty should get together and try to create novel approaches to a kind of core curriculum that offers what they think as a college or as a university gives you a sense of what an educated person actually is. Right? And then there could be actually genuinely different sorts of approaches to higher education rather than the same freshman seminar that exists at every one of these places and the same distribution requirements that are more or less the same and so forth. Then you would have different visions. And if you could offer those originally as a kind of optional element, like at Yale there's something called directed studies, and you don't have to do this, you can do the pick and choose curriculum instead, but you can do directed studies. I think that's certainly something that would be valuable. For today, what seems to me important is that we don't pick something that only makes you read Latin and Greek. I'm sorry. I mean, for professional reasons, it would be wonderful if everyone at the University of Maryland had to study Latin and Greek, although our department would need to be enormous if that were the case. But instead, we also have to craft a curriculum that seems to me suited to the contemporary world, which means cognizant that there are different religious traditions than simply Protestantism, as was the kind of issue in early American education, and also cognizant that there are different traditions other than the so-called Western one too. Right? So I don't think I want to go back to a kind of great books model of 1930 at the University of Chicago. I don't think that that's reasonable either. Right? But so the short answer, I guess, is I don't have an answer for exactly what the good life is, but I think it's duty-bound on faculty members to try to figure that out and to try to shape institutions in the way that offers an answer to that question. The reason why we don't do that as faculty members, I think, is because we'd never stop fighting. Probably. We'd never actually leave a faculty meeting in which we had to hash out what a core curriculum actually should look like. And so instead we just say, you pick. You figure out what it is to be an educated person. I think that's an abdication of our role as educators to do so. I don't have an answer, a specific answer to that either, although it seems to me that there is one place in which we could genuinely as humanists get the benefit of those in the social sciences and those in the natural sciences and so forth, that they can kind of contribute to this conversation. It seems to me that one of the problems with undergraduate curricula and having a core to begin with is that the natural sciences don't fit very well into these cores. In part because the sort of goal of the natural sciences has always been kind of standalone and different from the goal associated with the humanities. But it seems to me that one of the things that we can do is we can ask philosophers those questions, and they can teach classes on those topics. We can ask religious studies professors those kinds of questions, and they can teach on that topic. We can ask biologists those kinds of questions, psychologists those kinds of questions. So I don't think that we should have a curriculum that only focuses on that particular question, but I think that it's a valuable one to shape the kind of curriculum that I'm talking about. I think one of the major reasons why it's so hard to take some of these ideas seriously is that we've seen people like a Nazi regime in which people were supremely educated and yet turned out to be absolute moral monsters. And it's hard for us to believe even what Bruni believed, that you could read classical literature and you could be a good person from having done so. It's very difficult for us even to believe that. Well, why is it difficult for us to believe that? And what can that tell us, it seems to me? So having some sort of question-based curriculum which allows people from different disciplines to attack those questions seems to me another way of possibly ordering a curriculum. So when we're looking at Bruni's curriculum, it largely comes from a letter that he wrote, and he sort of advocates in the favor of, what sort of tutoring should you receive? And we don't see in that letter a kind of careful exegesis of Augustine and exactly what's going on. What's more important for him, it seems, not only is the thought of Augustine, but also the style of Augustine. Right, so for us, it would seem kind of absurd. You're not going to read Aquinas at all? I mean, but you're not going to read Aquinas at all. He doesn't want any kind of medieval scholasticism to have that kind of influence. And some of it is he genuinely believed that by reading stylish authors who know how to write well and to learn to write like them, you're going to become a better person anyway. So part of that is. So now whether we have, a fully figured out kind of exegesis from Bruni on regard to Augustine and his thought. I don't think we do. Someone who's a Renaissance scholar would have to offer a fuller version of that. But I don't think that that was precisely what was important or revolutionary about his idea. It was really that you can sort of cut off in the 5th century AD and you don't have to read anything after that time. So there's a belief also that reading prose and poetry written in certain types of ways can also make you a good person as well. Anything else? No, well, thank you very much for your time.